Good evening, this is Dr. Thomas Klein. I am a specialist in rare and chronic diseases. I'm coming to you from my office in Raleigh, North Carolina. We have tonight myth number 8. Overprescribing is responsible for the opioid crisis, the epidemic, overdose deaths, addiction, and scourge of drugs. And no, it's not. In 1915, Harrison Act was passed to tax opiates to try to discourage their use. Back that time, they felt they were bad and immoral. The word immoral crops up a lot. It cropped up in 1915, and it crops up again in the 1970 Controlled Substance Act of Richard Nixon. It actually says in there that this causes moral problems. Drugs cause moral problems. In the DEA regulations, it also says that morals are an issue. So that's an interesting overlay. We're talking about pain medicines, and the government is talking about morality. It goes back to the turn of the century. We'll discuss this at some point about the true history of how this has happened for over 100 years. But it had to do with people smoking opium and the feeling that women who smoked opium, especially white women, ended up as prostitutes and ran off with Chinese. It's been in our fabric ever since then, and look, it's still there. Overprescribing is a word that I, as a physician, don't really use. In medicine, we'll say inappropriate prescribing, and I'll give you an example. Antidepressants are prescribed twice as often as they need to be. Now, I would consider that overprescribing. The assumption that we are prescribing opiates for people who don't need them is only true in a very, very tiny percentage. You see a lot of things in the literature about, oh, doctors are prescribing this for sore knees and low back pain. That's not true. Nobody's proved that. Nobody asked us. They're using these kinds of things as polemics, as a way to push their agenda, which is as we've said before, fear of addiction, phobia. Because in our country, a junkie is the worst possible immoral person. And as we know, junkies actually have type 2 opiate addiction, which is genetic. They're not immoral. They did not make poor choices. They have a real disease. We have other diseases that are genetically triggered. They're kind of rare. You may not have heard of them. One is an anemia called G6PD. Another is called phenylketonuria, which babies are screened for. Those are genetic diseases that without a trigger, nothing happens. So if you have the genes for opiate addiction and you never take an opiate, no one will know. You will not be addicted. It triggers the genetic addiction, and it's still rare. And remember, from our myth number 1, you cannot just addict anyone. This is rare. But this is what's behind the fear of overprescribing. If doctors give out too much, this is going to happen. But it's not true. If this was true, 96 million people take opiates every year. 96 million, that's a third of our population. Half the population should be out in the street shooting up behind dumpsters, and they're not. In fact, the government says we have the same number of addicts that we've always had by percentage. So when you hear that addiction has increased, overdose deaths have increased. The assumption is that addiction has increased. That's not true. So, do we overprescribe too much? Who knows? It doesn't matter. If you gave 1,000 people opiates, only 1 to 4 are going to addict. Coming back from Vietnam, the addiction rate after being on IV heroin was 2%. So there's something wrong with this assumption. What it's being used as is a way to jail doctors. If you read in the paper about doctors being arrested, this is what they're accused of: overprescribing. So is overprescribing too much? With too many people? Too much to too many people? Well, this all goes back to the milligram phobia, or fear of high doses, which we're going to talk about in number 9 when that comes up. So what's really the concern is if you give medicines to people who need it, they won't addict. If you give medicines to people who do not need it, they will addict. No, that's not true. You can have a person who is being treated, who's getting ready to be treated for pain, and on their very first pill they can become addicted, fly off to the moon, as we've talked about before, or a person who's getting it for other reasons. It makes no difference. The reason that's being given is not the issue. But law enforcement is using this to hang doctors. Dr. Stephen Henson, MD, was sentenced last year after 6 people sold his drugs without his knowledge. See, that's considered overprescribing by the federal government. In other words, you are prescribing something to people who didn't really need it, but you don't know they didn't need it. They came in with these phony stories, but sounded perfectly reasonable. Doctors have to trust their patients. We're being asked to do things like check computer records, do urine drug testing. Is that to develop a doctor-patient relationship? No. That's to catch people, to imprison them. So we've all become deputies. And we're now looking for people. Oh, we caught somebody with an abnormal drug test. Get them out of the clinic. Well, the drug tests are abnormal all the time. So we're going to discuss on our next session high-dose phobia. Thank you.